Good morning, everyone. My name is Laurence Fennema. Tomorrow, November 11th, is Veterans Day, Armistice Day, Remembrance Day, the 106th anniversary of the armistice that brought an end to the fighting for those who knew about it, the end of the slaughter of World War I. November 11th became a federal holiday in the United States in 1938, and in the aftermath of World War II and the Korean War, Armistice Day became Veterans Day. On June 1st, President Eisenhower signed the legislation so designating November 11th. In today's service, John and I will tell a bit about our military service. I think that sharing our experiences serves two purposes. One, it offers you as our Northlake family a view into our military experience, a part of our makeup as the individuals whom you know. And second, I think that our stories help better acquaint people without military knowledge or experience with the language and images of those who, according to the words of the Constitution, provide for the common defense. Military forces make up a significant element within the Puget Sound community. Army, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard, which is part of Homeland Security, and units of the reserve components, National Guard and Federal Reserve units. Thank you for being here with us on this day.
Good morning. My name is John Poulson. I was lucky. I had fortuitous birth. I was born approximately 7.5 months before World War I. I was born April 27th, 1941. I grew up in a small town. Well, it was the biggest town in Idaho, the city of Boise. Population, when I left to go to the Navy, was about 25,000. It was an idyllic place, I think, in some ways for a child to grow up, especially a child who was as oblivious as I was of social norms and anything else. I went to, in my entire school time, from grade school through high school, there was not one black student in any of my classes. And although there were a lot of Hispanics in the area, we did not have any Hispanics in the classes. They were all out in the field. So I grew up, as I say, I was a bit oblivious. I enlisted in the Navy right after high school in September of 1959 because I was kind of aimless and did not want to be drafted. So I said, let's enlist. The Navy sounds better than gravel grinding, which is the term we use for Army people. So imagine my shock when I got to the recruit training center in San Diego. The recruit training center I had 60 people in my company of every possible background you could think of. In Idaho, when you grew up, you were able to drive legally at 14 during the day. And if you were a legitimate farm kid, you could drive at 12 if you could drive farm vehicles. So we had students driving to elementary school. One of the people in my recruiting class at San Diego, for some reason, the Navy decided to send him from New York City to San Diego instead of the recruit training center in the Great Lakes area. The guy's name was Abner I. He was born in Harlem, had never been farther from the house he was born in than the subway loop, was proud to say that he had ridden once in a taxi cab. That was the extent of his vehicular traffic. When I was telling him about we would drive 50 miles for a party and back home the same day. He just, 50 miles? I mean, I might as well said we went to the moon. So here's this white bread kid from Idaho showing up in a recruit training center, 60 people in my company, 10 companies in a battalion, and at the reserve training center, there were 10 battalions. So there were more people almost in that recruiting center than there were in the city of Boise. It was an amazing revelation to me that there were people who did not have the privilege I had growing up. There were also people who had immensely different backgrounds than I did. I learned real quick that you change your language real fast. We use terms in Idaho that were not acceptable in recruit training center. And in 3 months, I have to say the military does a great job. In 3 months, they turned a bunch of green kids into a fairly effective troop of people who could cooperate and do things together. Then I was lucky enough to be shipped to what some people would say was the finest vessel in the Navy, an aircraft carrier, the USS Bennington. Imagine yourself that there were 5,000 people on that ship when it was fully deployed with an air wing. The ship was about 780 feet long, 100 feet wide, and to the top of the mast about 220 feet tall. 5,000 people in that much space. The ship had a hospital, a commissary, mess halls for everybody, berthing for everybody. And on the ship, you learn that you work as a team. I was assigned to the OI Division, Operations Intelligence. We did, amongst other things, we were radarmen, so we spotted incoming traffic. We also stood lookout duty. And I remember 2 specific instances on the ship. Once I was on 07 forward, which is the 7 decks above the flight deck, standing lookout duty. So I was about 180 feet off the water. It was a beautiful moonlit night. You could see from 07 forward, you could see for 21 miles. That's where the curvature of the earth kicked in. And it was a beautiful moonlit night, and I could turn around and look backwards and see the wake of the ship. There's a thing called St. Elmo's fire. It's phosphorus that's stirred up by the propellers of a ship, and it looks like this beautiful trail of fire behind the vessel. And I realized, I could be anywhere. I mean, I was absolutely nowhere at that time. At that point, we were probably 1,800 miles from any piece of land. That was pretty impressive for a kid from Idaho. And another thing I remember was standing on 07 aft. We had fore and aft lookout stations. We were in a typhoon, and they finally called, said, "Lookouts, get off the weather deck, get under cover." And there were actually waves breaking over the flight deck of the aircraft carrier, which is 75 feet above the surface. And that was pretty impressive, again, for a kid from Idaho, to see water about that deep running across the flight deck. And I learned a lot in the Navy. I believe that I matured fairly well in that 4-year period. And then I got separated from active duty. I had a short stint in a squadron as an instructor. And my separation date was September 23rd, 1963. And Vietnam was just starting to warm up. And a guy who had a separation date 2 months after mine, married, had 2 kids, had his life planned. I had no plans at all. And he got extended for Vietnam. He was furious. And I said, "Hey, I'll take his place. I don't have anything to do." "Nope. Government rules, you're separated." Boom. He got extended. So I went home to Boise, and I had not been back to Boise. I made a couple of short trips back in that 4-year period. I went home, I got back to Boise, and one day I was walking somewhere with my dad, and he said, "Hey, I want you to come on down to the Ford garage with me. We're going to pick up my car. I had it serviced." He said, "I want you to meet the head mechanic there." And he used a term of reference that was so amazing to me. I just turned around and walked away from him. I couldn't believe it. And then I started listening. I started listening to my friends that I grew up with. And I started actually paying attention, and I realized that Boise was probably one of the most bigoted places in the world. Like I said, the terms we used in grade school and elementary and junior high and high school, that was just stuff. But that wasn't just the school kids, it was the whole city. And then, as it turns out, the whole state of Idaho, if you've watched the way they voted lately. And so the Navy for me was probably a blessing because it made me realize that I needed to get out of Idaho. So when I went to college in Idaho, and as soon as I was done with undergrad school, I came over to Seattle and went to grad school, and here I am. I like to tell people I'm from Idaho. I'm this far from Idaho. So thank you.
It's an honor to follow a distinguished ancient mariner like my good friend, Mr. Poulson. In June, don't giggle. In June of 1968, I was commissioned into the Army Signal Corps through the ROTC program at the University of Iowa. After communications training at Fort Gordon, Georgia, I was assigned to Fort Lewis, about 55 miles south of here. And my wife Diane and I moved to Tacoma. We attended the UU church there, and here we are 55 years later. My first assignment was with a signal battalion, my duty with which was quite uninspiring. It did, however, include my one and only court-martial. I was assigned as defense counsel for a young soldier who had admitted to the offense, away without leave, AWOL, with which he had been charged. And he admitted to it, so it made my task very easy. One distasteful bit of training was preparation for crowd control. Anti-war demonstrations were picking up, and we were prepared for anything that got out of hand. And very fortunately for all, we were never called. Also in that summer, I was involved in training ROTC cadets. This is the 6 weeks of tactical and leadership training that cadets undergo between their junior and senior years. I was involved in night exercises, so we spent a bit of time wandering around in the woods in the darkness, in which, as the saying goes, I could not see my hand in front of my face. In July, I received an order for Vietnam. In September, as a consequence of President Nixon's accelerated reduction in the level of force in Vietnam, that order was revoked, and I was sent to Korea in October of that year. I was assigned as a communications staff officer at the headquarters of the Artillery Brigade of the 2nd Infantry Division. The division occupied positions between Seoul and the DMZ, the demilitarized zone that separated the two Koreas, with infantry units rotating through patrol duty together with South Korean soldiers along the DMZ fence. When I visited that area on a brief mission with several soldiers in my section, we watched North Korean soldiers watching us. We did not wave. The 7th Infantry Division occupied positions to the east of the 2nd. On October 18th, shortly before I arrived in Korea, 4 soldiers of the 7th Division were ambushed and killed by a North Korean patrol. On Christmas Day, personnel of our base hosted Santa Claus and several children from a local orphanage. I learned from a staff sergeant in my section that he had been visiting that orphanage, so I asked him to take me along on a visit. Over my remaining months in Korea, I spent part of my spare time at the orphanage, and I got to know the staff and a good number of the children. I came home on leave in early April of 1970 and proposed to Diane that we adopt a little girl, Kim Ok, who was almost 5 years old. Now, Diane was a bit surprised, and despite what a child psychologist recommended, we decided to proceed. And I became figuratively pregnant father-to-be, seeing to the necessary preparations. One day, through a faint trans-Pacific phone connection, Diane heard her gestating, so to speak, daughter-to-be say to her for the first time, "Hello, Mommy." I left active duty in September, and Oki arrived on November 3rd, 54 years ago last Sunday, escorted by a soldier from my section who was coming home on leave. Some of you know Oki. She works up the hill here at the Costco store. 2 years later, our son, Isong, arrived from Korea. Lee served 20 years of active duty, most of it in Army aviation, including combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. So, 2 wonderful consequences of my service with the 2nd Infantry Division. When I returned to Korea after my leave, I found that a Signal Corps captain had been assigned to my position, so I, being a lowly lieutenant, moved to one of the division's artillery battalions, 1st Battalion, 12th Artillery. The artillery weapon of this battalion was the Honest John rocket, a 1950s weapon that was deployed in Europe until the 1980s. The rocket had a range of about 16 miles and could carry a conventional warhead of about 1,500 pounds of high explosives or a nuclear warhead of up to 20 kilotons, the equivalent of 40 million pounds of TNT. The bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima was a weapon of about 15 kilotons. The delivery of chemical agents such as sarin nerve gas was also a capability, although I never heard mention of that. The Honest John was deployed as a nuclear-capable tactical weapon as part of the defense against the immense forces facing Western Europe and South Korea. Now, one of my duties as a communications officer was to make a monthly trip to division headquarters to pick up the most recent practice nuclear release codes. If we were to have received an order to employ a nuclear warhead, that order would have had to have been authenticated through the use of these release codes. Well, one fine day, my driver and I were returning from division headquarters with the codes, and we were entering the town next to our base, and what do you know, we had a flat tire. Next to the road at that location were several houses known in the GI network as the Turkey Farm. Houses of ill repute, if you catch my drift. Why it was called the Turkey Farm, I have no idea. 2 or 3 heavily made-up women came out to chuckle at our predicament and to offer us a refreshing break from our labors. So there we were, my driver hard at work with a flat tire, and me with my trusty .45 keeping a sharp eye out for trouble. The women appeared to be quite amused. After doing my bit to deter an attack from North Korea, I returned home in September and was released from active duty. In July of the next year, 1971, I entered active reserve service with a communications training unit in the 104th Division training at Fort Lawton in Seattle. Some of you may know it. It's out where Discovery Park is now. It's a great location. The 104th Infantry Division, known as the Timberwolf Division, reflecting its Northwest origins, served in Europe in 1944 and 45. After the war, at some point, it was reconfigured as a training division. The units in which I served would be considered strategic deep reserve units. They would be mobilized in the event of a national defense emergency. The unit in which I served the longest was a transportation terminal unit, the mission of which was to manage an ocean port through which military material would be shipped. Our most valuable training occurred when we spent 2 weeks at the port of Tacoma, managing the receipt and loading of vehicles being shipped to North Korea for an annual exercise with the Korean military forces. This is the exercise that always drives the North Koreans into a big huff. During that exercise, a soldier not of our unit was killed when he was caught between 2 vehicles being positioned on the ship. It's a very noisy environment. The assignment that I found most rewarding was as commander of the 1st Battalion, 3rd Brigade of the 104th Division, located in Bothell. Upon mobilization, our battalion would have been charged with the initial training of several hundred recruits over 8 weeks of basic combat training. On reserve status, however, we obviously had no trainees, so our main job was to ensure that our company commanders and drill sergeants and staff were able to qualify to perform their active duty missions. A notable event of that period was that I participated with 8 other members of the brigade in running the 1992 Hood to Coast Relay, almost 200 miles from Mount Hood through Portland to Seaside, Oregon. A very breathtaking experience. After I had been with the battalion for about 16 months, our brigade commander retired and I assumed command of the 3rd Brigade with an unusual and unpleasant mission, assisting members in finding new assignments, like I was trying to kick everybody out of my brigade. Due to a reorganization in the division, the 2nd Brigade in Renton was being reflagged, redesignated as the 3rd Brigade. Any member who didn't find an assignment in the new 3rd Brigade had to scramble to find a new assignment. After 14 months as brigade commander, I scrambled myself out of the brigade to a position as an assistant inspector general in the 124th Army Reserve Command at Fort Lawton. 8 months later, I entered my final reserve assignment as the Deputy Chief of Staff for Information Management on the command staff of the 124th. I left active reserve service in March of 1997 and formally retired in June of 1998, 30 years after commissioning. I had served with active reserve units for 25 years and 8 months, and now I've been out of uniform for longer than that.